to that. Right, the subject photographs, I guess, and I do have the date on it, so that's a useful benchmark. The Tekapo power station will be familiar to many of you who've been in those parts of the world, and we're actually flow gauging there in the middle of July, and fairly typically, because Tekapo is quite high, there was a fair bit of snow around and it was freezing cold. So there's the typical Ministry of Works tinny in the front there, and they had quite a decent amount of gear on even those days, a gauging cable on the front, the winch and so on. And at the time there, they were actually doing dye dilution measurements to gauge the flow by that method. So we did all kinds of measurements there. So by 1977, if we could do a flashback there, it's I guess some of you will find that a little bit far back, but it's we really had made quite advanced strides in getting the hydro system going, and it was we had at that stage almost joined the Tekapo and Pukaki canals, Pukaki lakes with the Tekapo canal, and also I was actually leading the field testing program for the power division there, and the special priority of that was to find how much trust could be placed in our computer simulations, because these were all made well before the canal was built, and when we put real water into a real canal, everyone, including me, was pretty concerned that the predictions would be in error, but the question was how much by. So that is why there was that 100 staff years, or man years as they were in those days, because literally there were no women involved in that job then. But I have used staff years for many years now for obvious reasons. The computer modelling then included options of the canal flowing in both directions, either for conventional power generation from Tekapo to Pukaki, or for pumped storage transfers back from Pukaki to Tekapo. So it wasn't something that was not considered even then. This is a drawing of the time, and that was issued with some of our instructions on operating instructions came out. I was co-author of that with the late Gordon Lovett, who many of you will remember. And that is fairly typical Ministry of Works powerhouse, pretty solid, but not too many fancy extras. Generating capacity 2 by 80 megawatts, and 80 were quite big generators at that time. The intake flow capacity was 120 cumex, and so if we extended it by one 80 megawatt pump turbine, we'd have the capacity for 320 megawatt power range, because we could go to plus 240 megawatts, I say short term, because the canal would draw down rather quickly, so we couldn't do more than a burst of that. But often these stability things only need a minute or so of power at that rate anyway. And of course we could go with a pump turbine, we could go all the way back to minus 80 megawatts, which is 80 megawatts of pumping. So that there's quite a big range in that station already available. This is a model from the time, and the results are, I've added some notes on it since, but this is shows the canal bank in the green, the canal bed, it's black, but I've coloured the tidal brown. And so obviously they're both sloping from left to right because the main flow was intended to be from Tekapo to Pukaki. That was the money flow, if you like, at the time anyway, or where we got the generation. But I was conscious that we might want to pump half the flow back in the other direction, and we actually tested up to 70 cumecs. And as you can see, there's still a reasonable margin between the level at what's now become the upstream end and the canal bank level of the time. Down here, you start to get some quite severe drawdown at this end because the canal is narrower there than it was further down, and particularly here where there's a small lake. But even so, it does not reach critical flow, which of course, if it did, the whole thing would collapse. You just wouldn't be able to drive it through anymore. So it's quite realistic to go to 60 cumecs anyway in the reverse level, and that was established as far back as 1977. Since at least twice as much time was normally spent during low power demand as during peak load demand, the return capacity of the canal only needs to be about half the peak flow capacity because it's going at least twice as long. So you can go quietly back, refilling Lake Tekapo at 70 or 60 cumecs. And when you're wanting to generate peak power, you can whack it open in the turbine direction, and you can get 180 cumecs through it for a short time, like a few minutes, but that's all you need for balancing. So validation of channel wave models. This is a wave test we did on a canal that had been built there, which was the venerable Rangitata diversion race. You can see the gate is over there to the right, around the corner, and here comes, there's about a metre difference in head between when the gate was closed, and we were able to whip it open with the help of a D8 and a winch in about 10 seconds. So we slammed the gate open, creaking and protesting, because it was a 1930s concrete structure and never been treated so roughly before. It had a worm drive which was supposed to take about 3 minutes to get from bottom to top. So the bulldozer did it in 10 seconds. But yes, the mechanical people said that they were quite happy with that, and it worked. And we've got quite a decent surge wave coming down towards us. It's getting towards a metre high, and that's what the interesting thing from the point of view of tsunami comparison is, that having a 1 metre step in the water level behind the gate and in front of the gate, when you whip that gate open, it's the same thing as if there's a jump in a metre in the height of the ground on one side of the gate, on one side of the fault, shall we say, and the other side is either stays where it is, or the combined movement anyway is something like a metre vertically. And so you get something like that happening under the sea or in a river, or indeed a canal. You'll get a wave that's very similar, very comparable with the one we've got there. And I note, for example, that these waves could be observed there in these laboratory conditions. Here are the observers there standing back a little cautiously when the wave came past. It looks a bit more formidable than it actually is, but and we had these scaffolding systems with gauges there, and they all had stopwatches, so they were all working stopwatches. So it was a little bit primitive, but it was workable. And so we were able to get the progress of this wave down the canal, and the scale. This is something like the size of the Avon River, as you can see from the size of the figure there. And in 1868, a tsunami of about this height was reported coming up the Avon River, the 1868 tsunami in Christchurch anyway is the largest in our recorded history or observed history. So we're able to reproduce tsunami of that scale and test that our models work with them. We go to the, this is the same canal there, the Rangata diversion race again, and this is the first observer over here. And there's the gate that's just been whacked open, the bulldozer's in behind there, Ministry of Works truck of the time was there. And here we have a similar event in the Tekapo Canal. This is one of the commissioning tests we did. And we had some fairly fancy telemetry gear there. We built these pillboxes with level gauges inside, and we had them telemetered back to the control station, and we're using those to ensure that the canal was operated safely, because we didn't have a spillway to get rid of the water if something happened. And so it was really a very bad thing if the canal water actually overtopped the banks. And we relied on the computer simulations to make sure that they wouldn't. And of course, the computer simulations in turn were tested during the commissioning tests to make sure that they behaved as everything behaved as expected. And I was very proud of the results we got within 2 centimeters of the eventual levels at all stages of the waves passing. You can see the wave here is more difficult to see because the canal is a much bigger one, and the change in flow is somewhat less. We also couldn't wind the Tekapo A gates open nearly as fast as this poor old gate here, so that we took about a minute to wind it open. So we get this rather flatter looking surge. We were trying our best to get a step wave coming down the canal, but the physics wouldn't allow that. So that was the wave. But of course, this one was traveling a good deal faster than that one. That one was about 15 kilometers an hour, and this one was, I think, about 40 kilometers an hour. So we used to drive along the road behind the box and watch it go, taking care to keep our eye on the road as well, so we didn't drive into the canal. So we also had a high-speed capacitive sensor here, which the central labs at the time organized as with a chart recorder and so on, in case where we were interested in what the wave shape was exactly, and we knew that the standard water level gauges are quite damped, so they won't respond to very rapid waves such as the one we can see here. So since about 1979, as I said, the hydro system has been more or less completed to date. And this is what it looks like now, and this is what it looked like then. By that time, Pukaki was full. So it's dominated by Pukaki. You can see the, what's going on here? Yeah, doesn't seem to want to give me a pointer. Oh, there we are. Right, we've got an arrow back. The Pukaki, as you can see, is 1.9 terawatt hours, which is a fashionable unit. Now we're talking about Lake Onslow, which is 5 terawatt hours. So Pukaki is up there, but it's about 40% of the size of the proposed Onslow scheme. Then the other lakes come in a little somewhat less, but in combination, that's Topo. Whoops. Oh, I won't bother going back now. So the next thing is we've got the pump storage classification, and we have what's called an open loop one, which I prefer to call once through, in the sense that the water is really only pumped up once from somewhere else, because this lake down here is not normally very big. Lake Roxburgh, for example, is a tiny fraction of the proposed Onslow capacity, so really it can't be seen as a second lake. And so what happens if the Onslow is discharging at a reasonable rate, certainly at anything like the 1 gigawatt that might be expected from the maximum performance of the power generation of the scheme, then it's not going to stay in Lake Roxburgh. It's going to go down the river and be lost. So this is a bit unfortunate for if we have a dry year and we have all this water and we have to actually spend it if we're going to operate the scheme, because it just goes straight over Roxburgh and down the Clutha River to the sea as soon as it comes out. The closed loop, this way, certainly in times of drought, is a much preferable system because it doesn't actually use any water at all. You have the lower reservoir, pumps the water up to the top, and it puts energy into the water, but there's no extra water involved. And then the same water comes back down again in the generation part of the cycle and goes to the lower reservoir, and you can do that as often as you like. And so that is a much more like the Pukaki Tekapo situation, where you have Pukaki being a much larger reservoir, is able to be to run with some discharge downstream to through Ohau and so on. But effectively, you're not using up water, you're not losing water by pumping some of it up to Tekapo. It just goes backwards and forwards. Now, coming to the discussion of the Onslow scheme, we have this thing called a dry year, which keeps on getting mentioned, and I'm afraid that's a bit of a myth. It's been there's a bit of a misunderstanding about what exactly it is. No one actually defines what is a dry year. The nearest we seem to come to it in terms of Transpower and the Electricity Authority is 1992, because that gave the lowest curves of the national hydro storage, and that's this curve you can see running through here. I hope you can all see this. Now, 1992, it got so alarmingly low, we almost ran out of storage, down to the last terawatt hour, 1,000 gigawatt hours. We're dipping well into that. And so there was this big call for savings, and we were instructed, you know, as most of you will remember, that to turn off our power as much as possible. And in fact, there were even power cuts, I seem to recall. And so I think a lot of industry was compulsorily shut off, for example. So that's kind of the standard dry year as far as Electricity Authority and Transpower are concerned, but it's not really a dry year. If we look at the, was it dry? Well, let's have a look at the records. So here we are in 1992, and this summer here is actually defined for this graph as December 1991 to February 1992. So that was the beginning of the year, and that was only the fourth driest of the decade. You can see 1997, 2000, 2001. If you look at the light grey curves, they're the ones that actually happened rather than the ones that were modelled. They're all lower than 1992. So in winter 1992, you have this this one here. True, it's a little drier. Again, look at the grey curve. There are some others that are not too distant from it, but it's still nowhere near the 80-year minimum, which is the one that comes from the full 80-year records that we have available. So is it really a dry year? The other point is that 1992 was unusually heavy snow, and of course what we're looking at here is the inflows down the Pukaki River past Mount Cook, and a lot of the precipitation will be locked up in snow higher up, an unusual amount, so that it wouldn't be running down the river in the winter time, but it would have been made up later in the year. So if we look at it, the government official yearbook, this is a direct extract from the electronic version of that, says a very significant year for weather in New Zealand. It was very cold, nothing mentioned about dry. And then it goes on with the reasons, easterlies, low pressure systems and so on. The national average temperature was the lowest since 1945, and you can see this in the little plot I've added below here. Here's 1992, and there's 1945, and you can see, apart from that, it's way below anything else in that period. So it's, the weather was cooler due to the El Nino, which was present during the first part, and the effects of ash from Mount Pinatubo, which was still present back in June 1991. In fact, probably you wouldn't expect it to come through very quickly from Pinatubo being in the northern hemisphere anyway. It had to get across the doldrums and the equator and all the mixing that went on there. But by 1992, it seems very likely that Pinatubo was making a bit of a dent in our temperatures. So then there's, continuing from the yearbook, winter snowstorms, 9th, 11th of May, Otago and Canterbury. June, record day and a night low temperature, Otago and Southland. And then snow in 8th, 11th of July in Canterbury again. And then the most severe snowstorm since 1939 along the east coast of South Island, the 27th to 29th of August. And some of you will have been in Christchurch at that time and remember it well. This is what it looked like. And it was pretty bad. And now obviously the cold just doesn't just lock up the water, it also increases the power demand. And that of course causes a dip in your storage curve if you're getting your power demand from the hydro lakes. So that's nothing to do with dry, that's much more to do with cold. So you've got this double whammy of the cold weather locking up the water and increasing the power demand. And of course, this explains why the storage curve was its lowest ever through that year. It was not merely a matter of being unusually dry. It was not unusually dry. And we've got to be very careful when we're talking about dry years. So this is from a report by a University of Waikato researcher, and he actually has done quite a bit of work on this. Yes, Earl Bardsley was his supervisor for this PhD, and he did a great deal of numerical work looking at dry years and so on. And he comments, this is an extract from his thesis, and I acknowledge that, and he mentions the extremely cold, where we go on, the extremely cold June 2006 month he was talking, might have precipitated a national electricity crisis had the southern hydro lakes not been fortuitously enhanced by high river inflows in April. Well, I'd say that fortuitous is not perhaps a word you should use when you're talking about probabilities. If it was unusually wet, a dry year until then you might expect by the law of averages that you get a bit of decent rain in April. And so it's a bit more than fortuitous. I think the probabilities suggest that it was to be expected. However, this time the low storage again caused temporary closure of TY point aluminium pot line. So here we are with the dreaded 1992, and you can see here this goes quite badly there, and then it gets a bit of a pickup once the snow starts to melt in October, November, and so it does recover to some extent at that point. In fact, it goes all the way up to up here. So that looks like a pretty good snow melt, November, December. And of course, it's likely to get a good snow melt because there's an awful lot more snow on the mountain than usual, on the mountains than usual. So part of the reason for the delay in the flow coming to reservoirs, the national reservoirs, especially Pukaki, would be that because the snow was all locked up the mountain, it wouldn't show up in the storage figure. So again, I think that needs to be considered. It's there, it's in the bank, but you ain't going to get it till November, December. So problems with the Lake Onslow proposal that Earl Bardsley is the main proponent of. It's in the driest part of New Zealand, so you want storage, you've got to pump the whole lot. It's something like 99% of the water has to come from pumping because it just hardly ever rains in that part of New Zealand. So that's quite different from a lake like Pukaki or indeed Taupo, where you have fairly decent rain in the catchment and it comes in for free. And 5 terawatt hours at 10 cents per kilowatt hour is $500 million. So this is a pretty staggering sum. Admittedly, I think Earl is hoping that you'll get it a bit cheaper than that, but that seems to be a fairly typical low price these days in the system. It is only an open loop scheme because Lake Roxburgh storage is a tiny fraction of 5 terawatt hours. So that's not helpful either. So you've got no rainfall and you've got no bottom storage. So it's not a great place to put a pump storage scheme. Existing power grid connections were designed to serve Roxburgh, and that's what they do. And the proposed adjacent, that's about 320 megawatts. Proposed adjacent station at a gigawatt is 3 times as large. So you've got to then upgrade your all your power grid connections by a factor of 4 in and out of Roxburgh. And it's quite remote from the rest of the power grid as compared with, say, Tekapo, which is sitting right on top of the inter-island line. Not only is it the inter-island line, but it's a DC line, which is one with minimal losses. So no comparisons have been attempted with a long-planned Tekapo canal scheme. We just got to say, here's a scheme, you know, isn't it good? But really, you should do a comparison with the ones that are already around, not just jump in with this one. The Tekapo canal scheme was carefully analysed and tested with 25 staff year tests going into the commissioning tests alone. And there I'm referring to the Tekapo canal. The 100 staff year I mentioned earlier was a rough estimate for the, including the Pukaki and Ohau canals as well, and indeed the 3 Ohau canals. Also, extensive computer modelling was done using an internationally awarded computational matrix solution in 1977. Lake Onslow seems to have been designed by a spreadsheet. All we seem to have is the fact that there's a storage, enormous storage you can compute by doing some quick measurements of the surface area versus depth. And that seems to be about it. So coming to Majid, he is the PhD student under Earl Barsley. He finished his thesis PhD in 2019, and he's done a lot more in-depth analysis. Certainly he's worked a lot with time series analysis, and that side of things is more satisfactory. But his conclusion is the proposed Onslow scheme was found to be hydrologically feasible and potentially provide multiple advantages and so on. Further down, we have a smaller possible pump storage scheme of 120 between Lakes Highway and Wanaka was found to be hydrologically and economically feasible. And I can't help noticing that there's a significant difference to me. G decides that the Hawiya-Wanaka scheme is economically feasible, but he fails to mention economically up here. And so the advantages here seem to be in terms of managing the water and energy systems and increasing hydroelectric energy generation from Waitaki, Clutha, Manipur and Waikato schemes. And that presumably is by providing a buyer for off-peak power when no one else wants it, and same for supporting wind energy developments and reserve, and then there's a bit of increased irrigation water and so on. So that seems to be his view of the advantages of the Onslow scheme, that it effectively allows it to replace the storage. The storages in Taupo, Pukaki, Tekapo, and Hawiya if it was built, because it's so big, it's sort of bigger than all of them combined. But I find that's a little bit facile, because you can't just take storage out of Taupo and stick it in Onslow and then get it back when you want to. You've got to carry a terrific lot of energy. All these terawatt hours of energy have to go through the transmission network somehow, and it's just not capable of doing that at the moment. Whether it could be upgraded, I don't know, but I still feel a little uncomfortable at the idea that we'll get rid of all the storage in Taupo, for example, because we can always get it up through the grid, even if the grid is capable of doing it in good conditions. I think that we can't assume that these lines are always going to be available, especially in storm conditions, that you can easily have a pylon get taken out. It happens from time to time. And then you just can't provide that backup. So it's I find the idea of saying, oh well, we can do without the Taupo and so on storages is a very high risk thought. It hardly recommends the idea to me. Also, the damage that the Taupo, Pukaki and Tekapo schemes are doing is acknowledged, but it is not. It is, I think, the public have become accustomed to it, and there are not really severe damages occurring in any of those lakes. I think Hawiya is probably the one that's exhibiting most signs of damage, shoreline damage, but the others really, bearing in mind also that they naturally, for millions of years, have gone up and down with floods and droughts and so on, and it's not unnatural for them to have a range of storage, and I don't believe that we should regard the storage in those areas at the moment being a particular problem. Then he going back to this, he mentions the Hawi Wanaka one looks like quite a good one, and he also points out that reduce the flooding risk in Wanaka, and maybe the Protection Act needs to be reconsidered in the light of that. That perhaps we like Wanaka to behave naturally, except when it floods Wanaka Township. Then I have a sneaking feeling that some people would prefer to see a little more exit capacity provided in those cases, and this would certainly do that. So coming here to replacing the Lake Taupo storage, the case that Margine makes is about the Waikato River. Extremely high flows were experienced between 9 to 20th July 1998. As a result, urban centres including Hamilton, Narrawahi, Huntley and Mercer were inundated, and so on and so on. The economic impact was estimated at $25 million. Now, that's a fair amount of money, but if you compare it with the cost of the proposed cost of the Onslow scheme, it's peanuts. Why spend $4 billion to save 25 million, even if it works? And I also find the analysis has some peculiarities. That the graphs that are plotted show the actual and simulated daily discharge for the Waikato River, Cambridge. Now, the blue is the actual, that's the historical ones, and the red ones what would happen if Onslow pump storage was available. So presumably all the hydro storage would be emptied out of all the lakes upstream. They'd all be run in a way that the entire storage was available for flood storage. And then he claims that you would get this much more benign lack of floods. But I don't like the look of these peaks here. We seem to have one roughly equal to the 1998 one and two above it. In fact, there's two others roughly equal to that, and the 2011 one is significantly above it. And this is supposedly the discharges at Cambridge. Now, as far as I'm aware, and I confirmed it again, we go to the records at the Hamilton Victoria Bridge in Hamilton. The highest recorded river level was July the 15th, 1998. Now, if that was the highest river level, what are these? Where do these figures come from? There's something wrong there. I suspect the flow analysis has somehow been messed up, because I just don't believe that they were getting more flow here than they would have been at the highest flood level in Hamilton. Cambridge isn't that far from Hamilton. So his file, and I've attributed this properly, his final version summary says, so the pumped hydro energy storage would effectively replace the current run-of-the-river approach for the Clutha and water behind the dams and Waitaki, and maintain the hydro lakes at mid-range stable levels. Then we have the reduced hydro spill losses and reduced flood risk with respect to Lake Township and Waitaki and Clutha rivers. So that all looks great if you accept that the Onslow scheme would actually do this. As I say, there are severe concerns about getting all this energy backwards and forwards through a inadequate national grid, and increasing the size of the national grid does not come cheap. So but then years of prolonged dry periods have found the simulated Onslow pump storage release compensated with lower generation from the Clutha, Waitaki, Banapuri, and Waikato hydropower schemes, and so on. So that he claims that was the result there. As I said, I think there's something wrong with that. I might mention also that the flows here before the 1998 flood were rather low, so I suspect, I haven't had time to go back and check the Lake Taupo records, but I suspect the Lake Taupo would not have been particularly full. Hugh might be able to remember whether it was just before the rain started, but I seem to recall from Hugh and I, particularly Hugh was involved in the direct management of that flood down the river using the modelling system in conjunction with Mighty River Power that we had set up for Mighty River Power, and so the flood was heavily controlled all the way down the Waikato River, and we felt that for a flood of that size, a $25 million loss was a pretty good result. So recommendations, consider the evidence favouring the TECPO scheme, and also consider the margin analysis of the similar Hawiya-Wanaka scheme. Thank you. Any questions, comments?
I would have a question to start things off. I may have missed it, but how many terawatt hours does Lake Onslow hold? Or what's the power, energy capacity there?
Well, there have been various estimates, anything between 4 and 12, I think, depending on how high you want to take the dams that are holding retaining the lake. And of course, they get more expensive as you go higher. But the figure that seems to be favoured at the moment for the Labour Party proposal was about 5 terawatt hours.
Right, so it's not huge compared with the storage in Lake Pukaki, which is 1.9 terawatt hours. And is that 1.9 terawatt hours, that's within the normal operating range?
Yes, yes. Roughly speaking, the combined major lakes at the moment seem to have about 4 terawatt hours in them. And in a way, the justification for Margit's justification anyway for building Onslow seems to rest on replacing all those lakes, because if you keep on using those lakes, there doesn't seem to be any case for building an extra 5 terawatt hours.
Further questions from anyone?
It's Steve Goldthorpe here. Can I ask a sort of a novice's question on this thing? I understand pumped hydro in places like Trausfynnydd work on pumping water at night when you've got spare electricity and letting it down during the day when you need electricity. And on a sort of daily cycle makes a lot of sense, depending on your background system. Are there many pumped hydro systems in the world where the period between pumping water uphill and letting it back down again to generate power are substantially longer than daily, perhaps annual? How common is that as a hydro technology, as a pumped hydro?
I don't think it's common at all. I think the figure's been touted around that Onslow one would be something like 25,000 times the size of the typical pump storage reservoir, and so on. And of course, for daily day-night transactions, you need far smaller reservoirs because you simply can't push all those terawatt hours through any kind of system. You know, you don't have you don't have terawatt size power stations to actually use the water. So, you know, a gigawatt takes 1,000 hours. A gigawatt power station takes 1,000 hours to chomp through a terawatt, and that's nothing like a day-night cycle.
Alistair, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I get a question associated with this. Really, when you look at from a point of view of a system operator, the desirability of pump.
I'm sorry, we seem to be losing you.
Wait, is that better? May have a problem with my mic. Is that better?
Yeah, well, yes.
Okay, all right, yeah. Switch the mic between the laptop and the screen. Right, so from a system operator's point of view, having pumped hydro in the system is, you know, you can see the obvious advantages of, you know, being able to balance wind generation and manage the system more efficiently. But on the other hand, here in New Zealand, we only have our spot market pricing system. So really the question is, from the established generator's point of view, what would be the benefit of doing a scheme like Lake Pukaki, Lake Tekapo, let alone the Lake Onslow scheme, if all it does is smooth out the generation peaks that come from, you know, new wind or solar or any other generation, when on the other hand we know that the only time the generators really make money is during those cycles of feast and famine, which seem to be so attractive that Meridian got pinged for it in the court case recently. So
Yes,
where's the financial incentive for anyone to invest in any of those schemes?
I think the big incentive is that the intermittent generators like wind do not conveniently come at periods of high demand, so that this creates a market for them. If a pumped hydro outfit is willing to pay for power, they won't want to pay a lot, but they will pay something when it's off peak and the wind happens to be blowing conveniently, and their generators have to be all turned off because they can't get rid of the power. Then they'd be very happy to accept chicken feed for it, because it means they at least get some custom. Otherwise, they've just got to throw it away all the time, and it's just a disincentive for building more wind farms.
Right, but again, if that is the key driver, then as Steve said, it is a case of day-night, inter-day or inter-week balancing rather than you know, inter-year balancing, let alone backup for dry years.
Yes, you could say there are two jobs really. There's balancing and then the storage, and hydro is very versatile, so you can do either. And I believe that this Tekapo would do a fine job of dealing with dry years to some extent. It's got about getting up for 37% of a terawatt hour available for pump storage, and that's less than a tenth of the Onslow scheme. But the beauty of the Tekapo one is that you can keep filling it up again every time there's a bit of spare power around, wind power particularly. You can keep on filling it up again, so you don't just have to pour it out like at Onslow. You've got to run it out, and you aren't going to get any more back in a time in a dry year. So you just got to run it out and hope that it lasts. Whereas with the Tekapo and indeed the Hawea type version, you've got an inflow coming in, a river inflow, a decent flow coming in all the time for nothing. And you've also got that possibility of being able to buy up wind power and so on and pump it back up again. And both Tekapo and Maui have that ability. They're a closed system, so they don't use water like the Onslow one would.
Yeah, can I have my name's Peter Whitmore. I was interested in Taupo. I mean, I guess there is, it's got a big surface area, so presumably it would have reasonable storage, but presumably you can't alter the level of Taupo too much. And there's also, for very short supply, there's that lake behind Taupo to the south that drains into Lake Taupo.
Yes.
Could that possibly do something for short term?
It's an excellent one for daily or weekly. It's quite a decent sized lake. It's bigger than Karapiro, I think, so it's quite a decent lake. But the problem with that is that there are significant Maori concerns, and they have some right of veto on projects in that area. So it's a question of whether they would find it attractive to give the okay to that.
The physical infrastructure is in place for Roto Ira, though, isn't it? There are the tunnels and canals to pump back up there.
Oh yes, Tongariro scheme is a wonderful scheme because it's a very high head, and so you don't need a lot of water to generate a lot of power, and it's also very nicely placed next to the North Island, some of the main transmission lines in the North Island, to provide a balancing function rather than trying to do it all the way down from the South Island and up through Cook Strait and so on and so on. That's quite hard work to provide. There was a small time delay, and it's well under a second, but those sort of things count when you're looking at stability problems.
Can I just ask an economics question? Godfrey Bridger here. Is anyone able, are you able, Alistair, or anyone else able to make a very rough wet finger in the air estimate of what you think the Tekapo project that you've so well backgrounded, turn it into the pump storage equivalent, not in capacity equivalent, of Onslow? How do we compare it? I think you said it was 0.7 terawatt hours. Did I catch that? I just missed, I think.
No, it's about 0.37 terawatt hours. So
0.37.
Yeah, 370 gigawatt hours is you've got available in Tekapo. Yes, so I've actually done those sums because it's reasonably simple. Because the power stations and the canal are already there, the only thing you've got to do is add remachine the Tekapo A and B power stations with pump turbines instead of well, in the case of Tekapo A, you might remachine the whole thing. But effectively, it's about the same cost as the work that the Mighty River Power have just done in Whakamaru. And that was, I think, from memory, about $80 million, because they completely remachined the Whakamaru power station, which meant they had to get in and stick these new bigger machines into the same power station, and that involved, of course, a bit of squeezing and pushing and shoving and so on. But basically, there was about $80 million, and I would think I'd be confident that the all-up cost to bring Tekapo in, as I said, without altering the canal, you could get up to an 80 megawatt pump turbine, and you just stick it in there next to the 2 existing turbines, and you've obviously got to enlarge the power station a bit, but that's all very similar to what's happened at Whakamaru. So I think $100 million with a fair bit of confidence would cut it. The isolation of the stations, Whakamaru is quite comparable with the Tekapo B and A. So, you know, they're not close to main centres or anything, but Mighty River did the work all right, no great fuss, and I don't see why there should be any more problem at Tekapo.
Thank you. A quick supplementary. This sounds like an extremely good prospect, and put it together with the other suggestions about Lake Taupo, the PhD that's been proposed, the TY closing or potential for TY closing means that it's a really good time to do a complete investigation of where we can go and what we can do, surely.
Well, particularly as the thing was being 90% finished back in 1977, and you know, we've got the canal and so on. It's got the capacity. We don't need to touch that. So it's really that would have been you know, probably 80% of the total cost of that job. So you know, it's there. So why not just finish it?
Is that owned by Meridian at the moment?
No, unfortunately, it's got handed over, confiscated from Meridian by the national government in 2011 and handed to Genesis on the grounds that they wanted Genesis to have an equal amount of capacity to back up storage, so that the big 3 all had the same amount of storage. And so they effectively split the ownership of Tekapo and Pukaki then. And it was a very bad idea because they're a natural pair.
Huh. Okay, thank you.
Another point, if I may, Alistair. With the Onslow scheme, we've heard, as you've said, there's lots of ways of doing the balancing role of pumped hydro, but it's the storage side that's the real driver behind that project, apparently. My concern is that if the valley that you build some dams and then fill it full of water and build a large holder for a lot of water up at the top of the hill, and you install the big turbines so you can use that when the country gets into trouble, whether that be a dry year or some other reason. But having spent an awful lot of money pumping all that water uphill, how much of it would sort of seep away through groundwater and need topping up as the years, months go by? I mean, is the natural seepage of water through groundwater something that is studied, can be studied?
Oh yes, that and evaporation, of course, and there is very high evaporation in Central Otago. But yes, there will be losses there, not the whole lot. But my concern is really that if you only need to have that storage available in a Pinatubo year, then you know, we're going to have $500 million worth of water or energy sitting up the hill there for an awful long time before the next volcano erupts, and that's a very bad use of, and no other use can be made of it. So there's a very bad use of capital, in my opinion.
I mean, if it's money sat up at the top of the hill and it's leaking away, then financially that's in some shape or form, that's got to be bad news, hasn't it?
Well, I think the financial leakage would, you know, you've got to pay some kind of notional interest on that money if you aren't going to use it, and that leakage would be far more serious to me than the water leakage. I mean, you've simply got a $500 million asset sitting up there, and it never, you've got no idea whether you're going to be able to use it in 10, 20, 30 years. In the meanwhile, it's just going to sit there doing nothing. And you've got, of course, a huge power station, $4 billion power station, which is doing absolutely nothing as well. I mean, it's just, and all the lines coming to and from, it's just a white elephant. Someone else has said, I think.
Also on the dry year theme, so if Onslow can hold 5 terawatt hours, but the curve that you showed of national storage showed, well, the lowest line on the graph was 1,000 terawatt hours.
Yes.
And it kind of looks to me like 5 terawatt hours is not a great deal, really. It looked like it dipped down in that dry period, or that low storage period, from about 1,000, yeah, 1,000 to 800 or something like that. So there's 200 terawatt hours, and you wonder whether the 5 terawatt hours in that sort of a year, how much difference would it really make?
Well, it wouldn't have been, yes, it wouldn't have been any use, because unless, as Majid said, you then throw away all the other storage, which is something like 4 terawatt hours now, and you take all that away and put it all back to natural running and so on, which is not, it's not natural to have it at median levels all the time either. But if you want to stabilize all those other lakes because they look nicer and so on, then what are you paying for? You're just paying to retire all these lakes that aren't doing any particular harm now. They're doing a good job, in fact. And that seems to me the only way you're going to get any use at all out of Onslow is if you do retire all those lakes, so you're forced to use Onslow. Otherwise, you might as well get it out of Taupo and Pukaki and Tekapo. I mean, incidentally, you'd have to empty Pukaki and Tekapo, as far as I can see, to fill Onslow. So that's not a great prospect either. You're just moving the storage from one place to another.
I'm not an expert on the subject at all, but I venture to suggest, Alistair, that where you're characterizing is not the way it's proposed, because it, as you suggest, it's the way you've described it as a white elephant. I don't think that that's what's being proposed, because it's so obviously a white elephant painted in those characteristics. I would have thought that the debate would be is that storage is required. We definitely need storage, and the most economic way to get that storage is under debate, and one of the proposals is Onslow, but yours must be the Tekapo Pukako must be an absolute must to be considered by the government. Otherwise, we are just wasting money, aren't we?
I've been trying to persuade them of that, because they could easily do it in one term of Parliament, amongst other things. So surely it should be attractive, because the Whakamaru scheme took less than 3 years to from start to finish. So could Tekapo, but we wouldn't need all this investigation and commissions of inquiry and things. I mean, the thing could be done.
But the first question to answer is, how much storage do we need? I mean, there's a huge difference between 5 terawatt hours and 370 gigawatt hours. So,
well, yes, there you would need more wind power to be built. There's a number of wind farms that are sort of on the edge of being approved by the various gentailers at the moment. And some of them, I think, we're waiting for a definite decision that Huntly was going to close, but others, with a little bit more encouragement, they're going to have a client, such as would be provided by Tekapo, for the periods of low demand, when they have this sort of buyer of last resort, if you like, available, because wind, you don't have a choice. It's just available when it blows, and you can't just shift it. Hydro, you do have the discretion to save it up for a few hours anyway, and use it when you want it. But the wind, it's the ordinary household supply faces the same problem. If they're trying to go off the grid and run a power supply, they have to have this big battery involved, because the wind insists on blowing when they don't want the power, and if they can put it somewhere and save it for later, then the whole thing works. But that's really the pump storage is exactly that battery on a very large scale.
Alistair, I'm a little bit terrified at how sensible the scheme is and how long it's made perfect sense for, and how the government seems a little clueless, or perhaps just not able to access the right advice to inform good investment decisions. It seems like they're flying a bit blind without what perhaps used to be the Ministry of Works. Have you got any ideas, as you've been thinking about this, about ways that the government could actually access far better planning and advice on these kind of decisions than what they're doing at the moment?
Well, unfortunately, we've been the victim of this market theory that what the market wants is what the government wants, and the government has relied, or both sides of the house have relied on that for far too long. What's happened then is that the thermal lobby has got the power, and they were able to produce people who are quite willing to pay for exploration and so on, in exchange for the rights to sell it if they find something. And they have been, particularly through Genesis, I believe, they have been able to keep Huntly open far longer than it should have been kept open. They've even been allowed to go and buy coal from Indonesia, which has been disgraceful. But that's the government has been persuaded that's what the market wants, so the government's reluctantly allowed it to happen. I think there needs to be a lot more assertiveness by government, that they aren't going to just let the market try and make up its mind what it wants, because we're getting these ridiculous Indonesian coal solutions coming out of that process.
Yes, I think the way you're characterising it, I have sympathy with the way you're characterising it, and I'm just wondering whether the pendulum is beginning to swing the other way, because I think what we did have in the old days was an ECNZ, Electricorp, that managed to centralise all this. Of course, it was open to all the market criticisms that you've mentioned, but it did have all the resources to do exactly what we're talking about here today, to maximise efficiencies in the interests of New Zealand. And that's what we need now. I'm hoping that perhaps Transpower might take a role there, because they are, after all, still 100% owned by government, and they are involved in shifting the power around in the way that you've described, and therefore very much more closely invested in the interests of the country than some of the gen-tailors are.
Yes, well, I agree with you that the Transpower are starting to develop some decent models at last of the whole network system, and they are able to run various scenarios through now, which have been mainly to do with market conditions. But I think they are now perhaps being persuaded that they ought to be looking at dry years and so on as well, because up to now they've not really seen it as their business somehow. If they can exert some kind of planning role, and in particular, I think for the dry year planning and so on, then I think that might be a way to go. That perhaps there is a point at which a Transpower or Transpower-owned generators might be allowed to come in, something like the old Whirinaki diesel system, was there as a backup against low power years, and that was run by some kind of a government organisation. But of course, the problem with Whirinaki was that there never was a case when it was needed, and it was just a complete waste of money, and that's why they tried to give it to Meridian, and Meridian just refused point blank to take it on because they could see that they were getting this dead loss outfit. Because the problem is that the gentailers will always try and undercut them when it comes to the crunch, and they're also quite happy to have the high prices dry year. They don't mind that too much either. And so there needs to be some kind of a circuit breaker there at a certain point where the Transpower as a central authority comes and says, well, look, you know, we'll take over now, we'll run the system until the situation gets better, and you'll have to supply power as and when. You'll have to talk to us about how we supply power instead of just bidding it on the market, because it's just the market system is an obvious crock. It's quite successful in wet years, of course, because there's plenty of power around and it drives the power down. So I think perhaps that, you know, there's something to defend the market when there's in times of plenty, but in times of shortage, where it's effectively a seller's market, then I don't believe the market really works, because the buyers have no say at all. They just get ripped off. And I think there needs to be a time when a central authority steps in and says, right, it's become a seller's market now. We can't go on like this. We've got to exercise some market control.
Yeah, Peter Whitmore here. It's getting slightly off the pumped hydro thing, but there's 10 consented but unbuilt wind farms, including one behind Huntly Power Station, that alone could supply half the power that Huntly does when the wind is blowing. So we're living in this crazy thing where these power companies love having Huntly stay in so that they can get more money because it pushes the prices up.
Well, I'm afraid.
But if Huntly goes out, which it should do, then we need the things like pumped hydro, because if we're not going to have Huntly even as a backup, then we need to be working on this options like pumped hydro.
Well, I believe that's the reason why many of these wind stations are consented but not proceeding, is because all the owners know that they'll be undercut by Huntly, who can afford, you know, they've got all their costs are sunk now, so they've got no sort of capital recovery costs. And so they can just charge any price they like and just kill anyone who tries to build a wind farm. And as long as they're allowed to go on like that, then you know, the market is just blocking the development.
Well, at the moment, some hydro stations have been accused of deliberately spilling, because they can make more money by spilling water and having Huntly in, which sets a higher price for the market. So the whole thing is really crazy.
Yes, it's all become too much involved with gaming and so on. Somehow the marketing people and the gentailers have got too much power.